Good afternoon. Thank you very much to all of you for joining me. I'm Patrick Schmitt, Master of Wine, Editor-in-Chief of the Drinks Business, and I'm delighted to be presenting this selection of wines and masterclass on the Pays d'Oc IGP. Here I am. Well, I'm sorry I can't be in front of you in person, but I am screening it from the wilds of Wandsworth, and you've given me an excuse to don a suit and a clean shirt, which makes a change from the last few months of, bumming around in PJs, etc. So thank you very much indeed for that. You've also given me a fantastic excuse to look really closely at this thrilling region in France and really bring together my experience of the wines for a masterclass purely on the varietal and commercial end of the Pays d'Oc. And I'm going to look very closely shortly at what I mean by that. But there are a set of 3 masterclasses, and this one really looks at wines from the key noble grapes of the world and at very important mainstream price points. Why the Pays d'Oc? That's always, I think, a question when you look at any region, when you make a selection of anything for wine lovers, buyers, be it the trade, professionals, or of course consumers. And the reason why I think the Pays d'Oc is very exciting is because, current wine trends really favour the well-known, be it a famous grape or a famous wine region. Then there's the authentic. People are looking for something that's distinctive, that's historic, that's effectively, hopefully, inimitable. They also want something that's affordable, particularly in the current times. There's a lot of uncertainty. People aren't shelling out a fortune on wine. And if you look at those trends, I would say there are few regions in the world that are better placed to sate them than the Pays d'Oc. For the winemakers itself, the Pays d'Oc is a vast viticultural haven. It's a kind of playground for them. There's immense liberty. They can play with different grapes, different wine styles, without the controls and the strictures that you might find from an AOP French wine region. They don't only have to do varietal wines, they can make blends. There are lots of very historic native grapes in this region. But those are probably more direct to the kind of more adventurous drinker. What we're going to look at today are wines that really have mainstream popular appeal. There's also a lot of quality in the region, and there's a lot of personality. These aren't lookalikes, they're wines with distinctive traits. One other thing, I think, why the Pays d'Oc is on trend, and that comes to the natural viticultural conditions in the region. It's a dry climate with a lot of wind, and that means that it has the ideal natural conditions for organic grape growing. So I really think the Pays d'Oc, if you're looking for kind of green labels, is a go-to place. A few other things. It's sustainable, as I said. There's a more esoteric element. But really, this masterclass is about helping you as people in the trade, as buyers, to find really good value and distinctive, well-made examples of wines from famous, widely available grapes, the likes of Chardonnay, Sauvignon blanc and Pinot noir. Before we go into the wines, I'm just going to give a quick introduction to the region, and I've kind of laid out a plan for the masterclass so you kind of know what's coming up. I'm going to look at a very brief history, and then I'm going to go into what I believe are the key strengths of the Pays d'Oc over years of looking at the region, tasting and visiting it. And they come down to its scale, its image, the diversity it offers, the level of authenticity, there's quality control, organics, as I've just mentioned, and then I'm going to look a bit more closely at varietal wines, give you an idea of what there is on offer for you as buyers, and then you're going to taste my snapshots, which are hopefully the wines you all have in front of you. Just very briefly, the history. I suppose what I would say, the Pays d'Oc as a classification is quite recent. It's just over 30 years old. 1987 was the first time it was used on a label, and for that we can thank Robert Scarley and the Fortin de France label where he used Pays d'Oc for the first time. Back then that was on a brand of variety labelled bottle of wine carrying Pays d'Oc, and we're talking about 80,000 bottles. Today we're looking at over 800 million. So it has become an extraordinary success story. About 24 bottles sold a second. And then in 2009, the region became a PGI, which is very important because it meant that there's an element of traceability and quality control with that classification. That's a little bit about PDI versus PDA. That's really for my own and your knowledge. If anyone wants more detail, they want a copy of the PowerPoint, I'm happy to share it with you. If you have any questions as you go along, please use the Q&A function on Zoom, and hopefully I can deal with those as we go along. Okay, so starting with the strengths of the Pays d'Oc. First of all, scale. I think this is really important. This is a vast viticultural region. It's 120,000 hectares are classified as Pays d'Oc IGP, and that's from an area in France, the Languedoc-Roussillon, which covers 240,000 hectares. So it's 10 times bigger than Burgundy. It represents 10% of the entire French vineyard area. Over 800 million bottles, as I've already said, that's 88 million 9-litre cases. So we're looking at the production level from a single region in France that's as much as Argentina produces annually. It's 16% of total French wine production. New Zealand, which is very much in vogue, and I think is a good place for comparing things in wine terms, a bit like in, I don't know, the UK, everyone always has a comparison with something being the size of Wales or the equivalent to. If we look at New Zealand, that's 40,000 hectares of vineyards, and Marlborough, the famous home of Sauvignon Blanc, is 23,000 hectares. So we are looking at a vast region, and that's important because it gives you a lot to choose from. Now, in terms of the production, just under 50%, just under half is red, 28% rosé. Now that's important. Rosé is a really exciting part of the Pays d'Oc. There's more rosé made in this part of France than there is in Provence, neighbouring Provence, so bear that in mind. And then you have 26% white. The other thing is that you have 1,000 producers to choose from and 160 cooperatives. So that's a little bit on the scale. The other important point, I mean, image is so important when it comes to wine. You know, what image does it conjure up? What is a country associated with? What is a region associated with? Well, the Languedoc-Roussillon and the Pays d'Oc as a classification, I think of bright sunny days, beaches, Mediterranean environments and vegetation, medieval architecture. You've got, 200 kilometres of beaches, you've got 300 days of sunshine, you've got the fortified city or town of Carcassonne, you've got the medieval Cathar castles that are on rocky outcrops. For me, it's a great cycling country. A couple of years I cycled down to Collioure. It's a fantastic part of France, a fantastic part of the world. So I think it has a great image to draw on. There's a quote there that I've put on this particular PowerPoint from Jacques Gravajal, who was the president of the Pays d'Oc Wine Producers Union when it first formed in 1987. And he there sums up what's so wonderful, talking about the vines that plunge into the Mediterranean Sea, the lakes, the vines at the foot of the Cévennes, which is the mountain range, and the Massif of Limoux, and then the other vines along the Canal du Midi. It really is, there's a lot to draw upon in terms of imagery, and there's a lot of enotourism as well in this part of France that's really developing. Other strength, diversity. Maybe a bit late for the presentation, but here's a map, give you a sense of where we are in France. So the Pays d'Oc area that it draws from, the Languedoc-Roussillon, extends from Provence, which is over in the east, to the Pyrenees down the south, the border with Spain, and the capital of this region is Montpellier. That gives you a bit more sense. Occitanie, which is the kind of district that it forms part of, and there you can see Provence to the east, and then the Aquitaine region to the west, the sort of home of southwest French wines, regions like Cahors, of course, a bit further north, Bordeaux. And in fact, there's a really good map from Wine Folly showing the region simplified and the most famous grapes. I see it associates Languedoc-Roussillon here primarily with Grenache and Carignan, the historically very important grapes of the region, but not what we're looking at today. We're looking at Pays d'Oc, and we're looking at the kind of commercial end that it specialises in. They say the Pays d'Oc is the most diverse vineyard, largest and most diverse in the world. And one of the things that's important about this part of France is not only the range of terroirs through different altitudes, through different influences of geology, but also the kind of the bedrock for the different soil types. So you can have sandstone, you can have calcareous clays, shale, and then these pebble terraces with those pudding stones that are so famous, les galets of Châteauneuf-du-Pape. Similar soil types, just without the famous brand of that particular region. But a lot of variation, I think, on these wines. When it comes to these wines, I'm going to talk a little bit about the terroirs that they're drawn from and why they're relevant to the style that we're going to see and taste. That shows you a little bit the mountain ranges. So that's the Massif Central down there, and then the Pyrenees shown, the kind of at the north and southern end of the Pays d'Oc region. Something I think is particularly important for Pays d'Oc, and it's really pertinent to the style of wines we're going to look at shortly, is the climate. But I mean, you associate this part of France with, hot sunny summers, bright sunny days, and rightly so. But the wines to me don't taste baked or sweet or jammy. That's partly to do with picking times and techniques and good viticulture. But it's also to do with the breezes. This is an area that is beset by 4 different winds, and they bring a freshness, and they also give a cleanness to the wines, but also the vineyard itself. I think one of the reasons why this area is so good for organics is that it's dry, but there's a lot of natural circulation from these 4 winds. They are the Mistral, the Tramontane, the Marine, and the Autun. So that's a really important point to bear in mind. Some of these winds are sea-based, some of them are cool winds from mountains. They can be hot winds as well, but they bring a freshness and a cleanliness. And I said here a restraint and a balance as well. I think it's important to mention when it comes to diversity, a final point, and that's not just about climate, that's not just about geology, that's also to do with the sheer number of producers. What you're going to see here is a tiny snapshot. It's important to say how I arrived at this snapshot. It's from a much bigger selection. But there are 20,000 wine growers, and there are 1,000 independent producers from as many as 160 cooperatives. For this snapshot of 8 wines that are flanking me here, I tasted over 300 different wines, and I did that completely blind because I wanted to really concentrate on style and quality without being tempted to think, oh, it's a Sauvignon, oh, it's a Chardonnay, oh, it's another Merlot, it'll taste like X or Y. I really wanted to focus on scoring them, on quality and assessment according to taste and style without thinking about the grape variety. And then after that, I looked at wines that fell in a certain quality sector, say all those wines I scored above 88 points. And I looked at those that fitted the particular themes that I had chosen for these masterclasses. So for this one, I looked at those grape varieties that I knew were commercially important in the UK and that I thought performed well in the Languedoc-Roussillon region, and that I then found out had performed well because unknowingly I'd given them a high score. Authenticity, I think that's very important with wine. These aren't sort of completely confected. You may be thinking, there's a lot of Cabernet, there's a lot of Merlot, there's a lot of Chardonnay in the world. Actually, there's quite a long history of playing with noble international French grapes in this part of the world. But the viticultural history of the Languedoc-Roussillon goes back several centuries. In fact, the first ever vineyards in France were planted around Narbonne within the Languedoc-Roussillon. So the vine actually entered France in this region. So few places really in France could compete with the Languedoc-Roussillon, the source of these wines in terms of authenticity. The Romans really developed winemaking to a bigger scale. The major grapes then were kind of really about Carignan, Mourvèdre, Grenache, Syrah, and also Saint-Cybele, which is the French, another name for Tempranillo. Strong Spanish influence. You could call this area French Catalonia. If you go there, you see the influence. You just only have to cross the Pyrenees into Spain. But it was under the rule of the Spanish or the Crown of Aragon for several centuries. So it's not surprising that those grapes that are actually native to Spain should be so prominent and dominant in this part of France. But it was really the threat of the New World, I suppose, is the way you'd see it, that prompted this part of France, the Pays d'Oc Producers Union, Robert Scarly, who I mentioned earlier under the Fortin de France brand. It was really him and Jacques Gravajal, who I mentioned earlier, who pioneered the idea of working with famous international French grapes, varietally labelled wines, to carve out a market for French wine abroad and really shore up the threat, the competition from New World wines that were varietally labelled. And Robert Scarly really went round in the 80s to a lot of the growers in this part of France and encouraged them to plant Chardonnay, Cabernet, Merlot, other famous international grapes. And you may think that's a little bit sacrilegious for a historic wine region, but it's played into its success. As I said, this was a region, there were about 80,000 bottles under that first launch brand, Fortin de France, that first Pays d'Oc branded wine, and now they're 800 million. So it's been very successful for France. Quality control as an IGP, I just think it's important to note that every single bottle of wine that carries the IGP logo is inspected and certified by Bureau Veritas. So there is an element of quality control with these wines. It's not just a label that's stamped on it with no further influence. There's traceability and quality element to it. Now, next and really finally and importantly on this, varietal wines. Just before I do that, just want to make sure that I moved on the right slide. This is really key. This is pivotal to the Pays d'Oc offer, the idea of what we're tasting today. Now, there's a lot of freedom for winemakers in the region because there are as many as 58 permitted grape varieties. So it's not one of those parts of France where grapes can appear on a label, you can use a certain number, you could make variety labelled wines, but hey, you can play with 1 or 2 grapes. There are 58. The palette is enormous. As I mentioned earlier, it's like a sort of playground for winemakers. And they're quite open-minded. I noticed that, the region is open to the addition of new grape varieties to that list, so it's not fixed either. What's important is this idea of selling wine by varietal. And that's because of the commercial importance. People buy wine by grape variety. 2/3 of all wine sold in the UK is variety labelled according to Wine Intelligence. And it is, when they do the consumer research, which they do a lot, it is the #1 cue for British wine drinkers. So I think that's very important. And in terms of finding wines that are variety labelled, that is when I think you default to the Pays d'Oc, because it accounts for 92% of all French varietal wine. Now, the range of grapes is really quite extraordinary. I mean, recent newcomers, Albarino, so closely associated with France and with Spain and Portugal, of course. Newcomers, some crosses like Caladoc, Sangiovese, Tempranillo, although it's part of the history of the region, is quite new to the list of Pays d'Oc wines, Carmenère. And I think there's some surprising aspects, well, surprising to me at least, about the Pays d'Oc. One of them is that Merlot is the most planted grape of the region. I suppose if you imagine that in the 70s and 80s, when the region was taking off and they were looking at grapes to plant, and they were thinking really of the commercial potential of what they were working with, Merlot, of course, would have featured prominently. More recently, Pinot Noir, of course, post the success of films like the Hollywood blockbuster Sideways. Pinot Noir is considered a kind of sexy, cool grape at the moment, particularly in the UK. So Pinot Noir is the 4th most planted variety in the Pays d'Oc. Marcelin, an important grape variety to consider. We're not going to look at today because we're looking at key noble grapes, but it's a cross that's rising in importance. Certain white grapes are on the rise. Viognier, Grenache Blanc, Vermentino, I've put there in brackets, Roll afterwards, what it's known as in France, particularly in Provence, Roll playing an important part in the whites and the rosés of Provence, but Vermentino in Italy, of course, the Tuscan coast, making some lovely whites from Vermentino. Marsanne, another grape, doing very well in the Pays d'Oc. Now, blends, they are on the rise a little bit, but they still are a tiny proportion of this region, so they're only 7% of the output. But a lot of success with the Mediterranean varieties, as you would expect of this region. So Grenache, Mourvèdre, Cinsault, and they thrive in the natural conditions of this part of France. But so do those noble grapes, particularly of Bordeaux, such as Cabernet and Merlot, and the famous white grape of Burgundy, Chardonnay. Others to consider that are rising stars, well, Grenache. Grenache is certainly a grape that's rising in popularity. Lovely whites from Muscat and Cabernet Franc are also considered rising stars of the region. Carignan, I think it's definitely important to mention Carignan. There's a Carignan Renaissance within the region. It's a grape historic to the Pays d'Oc, or the Languedoc-Roussillon, a Spanish grape by origin, undergoing a revival, in fact, in Chile at the moment, in the way that I suppose Malbec has been rediscovered by Argentina and made popular, even though it's the grape of southwest France. Carignan is the grape of Carignana in Aragon in Spain, just south of the Pays d'Oc region, is becoming a bit sexier and a bit cooler thanks to the Chileans, but definitely worth a look, and performs brilliantly in this part of France, very drought resistant, very kind of sustainable to work with Carignan, and produces good wine. The president of the region, Jacques Gravejal, believes that Cabernet Sauvignon is really the grape that with the most sort of noble element in this part of France. It produces very fine wines in the Languedoc-Roussillon, certainly that I've tasted. But this shows you a little bit about the most planted in the Languedoc-Roussillon region, with Syrah there rightly leading, I think. Syrah from this part of France is absolutely stunning, and Grenache too, but we're going to look at a Merlot shortly. And this shows you production of IGP wines by style. And I think it's important with this just to look at the top three in each case. So with reds, it's Merlot, Cabernet Sauvignon and Syrah. And then with rosé, we have Grenache Noir, Cinsault and Syrah. Again, great basis for making lovely, pretty, fresh, pale pink wines. And then in the whites, you have Chardonnay, Sauvignon Blanc and Viognier. Now, Chardonnay and Sauvignon Blanc both in there because of their commercial appeal. Viognier doesn't have the same kind of draw as those two grapes, but it is becoming more popular in the UK market. And I would say that Viognier in the Pays d'Oc, in this part of France, has really, really performs well. I tasted some absolutely fantastic Viogniers, including Vermentinos as well. Some that have that slightly peachy character, a bit like Viognier, but really very good Viognier from this part of France. We'll look at that in some of the later masterclasses. Some of the standouts I found from tasting, Viognier I've mentioned, Grenache Gris and Grenache Blanc in whites and Vermentino are really very, very fine. And reds as well as the rosés, Grenache and Syrah, and very good Cabernet. And that's really from my tasting over the years, but also the recent blind tasting. I looked at the wines that scored very well, and they tended to be made from those grapes. So the other thing I would say is of course, one would associate Sauvignon Blanc with the Loire or Chardonnay with Burgundy. There's a lot of these grapes grown in this part of France. So 25%, a third of all of France's Chardonnay and a third of all of France's Sauvignon Blanc actually comes from the Pays d'Oc. And a quarter of all of French Merlot, which of course is a grape associated with Bordeaux, and 60% of the country's Syrah. So there's a lot of it there, a big proportion, a lot to choose from. Now, I've talked a little bit about the region. I hope I haven't rushed through too much, but I know that the really key thing here today is to focus on what the wines are like and the tasting. And for me, this is the exciting bit. And it was what was so exciting about being asked to do these masterclasses was the fact that when I said, look, I'm really happy to do them, I'm pretty clear on what I think are the strengths of the region. I came up with some themes. But I'd really like a chance to taste what's out there and see what's good. And having the producers flood me with over 300 wine samples, which loosely were chosen by them, I said, put your best foot forward. But by that, I don't always mean put the most expensive wine, just put ones that you think would have the most commercial appeal or potential and send it to me. And I said basically around 2 wines per producer. And I thought, well, I might get 100 or so. To get 300 wines was quite daunting. It took me a lot of time. All the producers, I promised them feedback, scores, detailed notes. It was a lot of work, but it was a really good exercise, and it gave me a sense of what obviously this is a personal judgment, but what I feel the region does well. And that's what you're seeing here is a tiny snapshot. And it was also quite pleasing to see after the reveal, after I'd broken down what I thought was good and according to the scores, that the producers that I had selected blind were in fact good representations of their type. And that's something I'd like you, if you can, when you're doing this masterclass. And normally if I was standing in front of you, we'd be doing a show of hands and counting, number of fingers in the air, etc., to get a sense of this. But I'd like to know from you, one, whether you think this particular wine is a good representation of its type. So if it's a Sauvignon Blanc, is it true to the grape variety? Does it deliver what the Sauvignon drinker would look for when buying and picking up a bottle of Sauvignon Blanc? After all, the grape variety is the key for the style. And secondly, and this is really important, and this is what excites me, does it represent good value, good relative value? It doesn't necessarily mean it's cheap, but does it represent really good value for the quality and the style that it delivers? I do a lot of blind tasting, and quite often I find great wines, and I'm happy to recommend them, and I always will, but they may be really expensive, or quite often they are stars and they're pricey. And, my peer group, my own purchasing power, my friends, my family, we don't buy a lot of wine over 20, 25 quid. I buy a lot of wine under a tenner. When I'm treating myself, I might 15, 17 pounds, but not much more than that. It might be different at Christmas or whatever, but, for weekend wine, I'm not spending much more than 12, 14 pounds. These wines are all sub 15 pounds. They're wines that I would happily buy. They're wines that I think are great value examples of their type. You can disagree, but it would be good to know. Of course you can disagree. I'm not saying I'm right. This is based on my own feelings. Now, we're going to start with wine one, a Sauvignon Blanc. I think when you're looking at the Pays d'Oc, you must consider Sauvignon Blanc. And I think for any buyer, you must always look very carefully at your Sauvignon Blanc selection. It's got to deliver, I think, the real appeal of Sauvignon Blanc, which is wonderful pungency. It's got to be instantly identifiable. I think, why is Sauvignon Blanc successful? I think it's very easily to identify. It's bright, it's cleansing, it's fresh, and there's a lot of flavour for your money. So obviously we've got the wines of the Loire in mind, maybe the sort of green, fresh, sippy Sauvignons of South Africa, and then of course the really sort of gooseberry, passion fruit, black currant leaf characters that you might find in New Zealand, particularly Marlborough. Where does this sit, and is it good value? Well, I'm going to taste it. So I've got a sort of children's party cup here as a spittoon, but this is locked down. What do I think? I was really impressed with this when I tasted it blind. It has a lot of pungency, some riper fruit notes, some passion fruit, black currant leaf, and then for me it finishes with a really kind of pink grapefruit freshness, maybe a bit of zesty lime. I really like the style. I like the fact that it's not too green, it's not too herbaceous. I like the fact that it's quite textural. It's not too hard, it's not tart, but it does have the kind of cool, zesty character that makes Sauvignon Blanc so popular and so appealing. And I think Domaine de Massiac, then of course, I look up what was number 51 in my flight and that I thought was a good example of Sauvignon Blanc. And I looked up a little bit about this domain and it was very interesting. It's certified organic, the domain that is, I'm not sure this wine is. It's based around in the Minevois area. They make reds under Minevois Rouge, the PDO. The whites are Pays d'Oc. And it's a cool area, limestone clay subsoils. It's sort of south of the Massif Central on the sloping area, the foothills of that mountain range facing the Mediterranean coast. And something I noticed that they wrote a little bit about when they were describing the soil types is that they mentioned that there's silex in the soils there. Now, for those of you who know the famous producer Didier Dagenot of Puy-Fumé in the Loire Valley, he has his label called silex, used to designate the particular type of mineral in the soil. and his Sauvignon is so collectible as a result of that association. Well, here we are, we have a lovely Sauvignon down in the Pays d'Oc, under a tenner, and it's grown in soils with silex, and I think it's very fine, very exciting fine, quite a traditional appearance. It's not under screw cap. I don't know whether that puts off some people. Not me, but I think it's a delicious wine. Next. Oh, someone's asked if they can see the bottle again. I've got some questions here next to me. Our second wine. Now, as I said, I did these wines blind. I didn't know what grape varieties were. All I could do when I was tasting was see the colour. And one of the wines I really liked in this tasting, it was one of my highest scores among the whites, later turned out when I looked it up to be an Albarino. And I picked it for this tasting because I thought, well, look, Albarino, it's a cool, trending grape, and it's something that's a bit of fun. And I think as buyers or passionate wine lovers, you're always looking for a story, and I think it was quite fun to be able to show somebody an Albarino that isn't from Spain. Of course, I'm assuming that you all know that Albarino or Alvarinho is from that part of the Spanish and Portuguese Atlantic coast. And it makes there a very fresh, I suppose people talk about the green style of wine, but quite often in Albarino I get, along with the citrus, I get quite a lot of quite juicy, peachy fruit. And then people talk about the mineral content, the kind of saltiness in the wine. Well, when I tasted this blind, as I said, I didn't know it was Alvarino or Albarino, but I thought it was lovely. I thought it was quite peachy. I thought it was quite zesty. I got a little bit of kind of almost smokiness to it, kind of flinty, I suppose, and a set of characters that I thought made for a really nice white wine. I later discovered it was Albarino, and then I also discovered it was from the Vignoble Foncalieu, which is a very big, modern, quality-minded cooperative in the region that unites about 1,000 growers across 7,000 hectares. But they were in fact the first people to plant Albarino in France, and that was about 10 years ago. This is all coincidence, I promise you, but there you have it, and taste the wine as I should again now, and I thought it, as I said, very good when I had it blind. Yeah, it's got that brightness, it's got that zestiness, but it's got some fruit weight. It's not too lean. It's kind of peachy. It's almost as though it's got a drop of Viognier in it, and I really like that. I think it's very fine. It doesn't taste exactly like an Albarino from Spain. I think that's important. It has some of the traits of the grape, but perhaps a little bit more richness and ripeness. And that's the personality of the Pays d'Oc coming through. Okay, wine 3. I'm so glad that I found a really good barrel fermented Chardonnay in this blind tasting. If you live down here in Wandsworth and you stayed with me, you'd find that we consume a hell of a lot of barrel fermented Chardonnay. My wife loves it, but I think it's a fantastic wine style. And I think the issue is that we all have in our minds the fine white wines of Burgundy, and they've just become increasingly expensive and for many inaccessibly priced. So one's always looking for alternatives. And there are great New World alternatives. I think a lot of the barrel fermented whites from South Africa are very good. But even there, most of them are really over a tenner. We're looking at kind of closer to 14, 15, 16 pounds. And of course, there's richer styles from California, places like Russian River, really over 20 quid. So where can you find in the world good, textured, balanced, barrel fermented Chardonnay for a tenner or less? Well, you can find it in the Pays d'Oc. And here's a really good example. Again, it was blind, and it was probably the best of the Chardonnays I had in the blind tasting. And it's called Marquès de Penotier. It's from Chateau de Penotier, and it's a producer. Actually, as soon as I saw it, I knew it well. I used to buy their wines from Waitrose. They have a very classic appearance, and they're in the region of Cabardès, more Atlantic influenced western area of the Languedoc, where in fact they grow a lot of within the rules of the AOP, they're allowed to grow Bordeaux grapes, the Cabernet family, but they also plant here at Pinotier Chardonnay and have worked with Chardonnay for decades and produce it to a very high standard, in my view. And I'm going to taste it again. Ooh. So yeah, I think that's a really nice example. It's got a balance, it's got a freshness, it's got a little bit of salty zestiness, but at the core is something quite rounded, quite peachy, quite textured, and then there is a little bit of barrel influence. It's not overwhelming, it's not like someone sharpened their pencil into the glass, but a little bit of cashew nuts, a touch of vanilla. I think it's really well made. The other thing I like about it, it's not part of that kind of modern style of Chardonnay, which I do like, but where it's very sulfidic. And people talk about sexy sulfides, and you get those characters of kind of like freshly struck match. It's not fallen into that camp. I think it would really please the lover of classic Chardonnay, the sort of person who likes quite rich, rounded, soft white wines with kind of flavours of cashew nut. But I think it's a really good classic example, and I'm very impressed. I mean, you know, this is barrel fermented Chardonnay for under a tenner. It is, well, it says it's under screw cap. The version here I have it is under cork. Widely available. Okay, rosé. I think rosé is a really important part of the Pays d'Oc offer. We all know, I think, the huge success, particularly in the UK market and the US, of Provençal rosé at the moment. You know, to the extent that if you make a wine that isn't bone dry and that kind of pale salmon pink, that basically few people are interested in buying it. The problem is with Côte de Provence is that it's kind of become a victim of its own success. It's a finite viticultural area, and the demand has started to outstrip supply. Grape prices have gone up, bulk wine prices have gone up. We've got a very successful figure in the Château d'Esclans wine brand, and Whispering Angel, now part owned by Moet Hennessy. The whole thing has just moved into this sort of amazing category that has made it expensive. And Provençal rosé now is rarely below, very, very rarely below £10, even on discount on the supermarket shelf in UK retailers. And headline prices are quite often over £20 for a Côte de Provençal rosé. So, where do you go? Well, you don't have to go very far. Neighbouring region of Languedoc-Roussillon, and under the Pays d'Oc IGP, you've got a vast amount of rosé, more rosé produced here than in Provence, a lot to choose from, and the same grape varieties. You know, the Cinsault, the Syrah, the Grenache, the Mourvèdre, and then the Vermentino roll, as well as a white grape that can be very successful, bring a kind of grapefruit freshness to rosés used extensively in Provençal rosés. This is a Cinsault and Grenache blend. I didn't know what the grapes were. I didn't choose it, I promise you, according to the colour. Again, I had a lot of rosés served to me blind in that tasting, and I thought this was a lovely example. It's pretty, it's delicate, it's the right colour, it's got nice packaging, but let's taste it. So yeah, it's good. It's got quite a nice amount of fruit, maybe a tiny lick of residual sugar in there. It's not a sweet wine, but a couple of grams. I don't think that's a bad thing. Fills out the mid-palate a little bit. It's not jammy, but it does have some slightly sort of sweeter, riper red fruit. Has a nice freshness. It's balanced. It's low in alcohol. I mean, some of those great top-end Provençal rosés, like the barrel fermented ones of Château d'Esclans, you know, are quite high in alcohol. You know, 14.5 is not uncommon. That's not a surprise from a rosé made with Grenache. But here we have something that's still quite fresh and quite low in alcohol. Happily could sip your way through half a bottle of that before dinner without realising. So I'm pleased with that. I think it's a good find. It's sub 10 quid and it's nicely packaged. And there's an example of what you can find in terms of rosé under the Pays d'Oc classification. So, And that's called Almus Cercius. And Cercius is the Roman name for the dominant wind in this part of the Languedoc. So it takes its name from that kind of climate mitigating element to this part of France. So it's a kind of terroir story as well, and I think it evokes the freshness that you also find in this rosé. Right, now onto the reds. I have got some questions that I'm looking at here. It's quite complicated to look at you on your computers and another screen giving me questions. I will have to answer some of these later. I do flash up at the end of this PowerPoint my email address, so you can contact me, but some of the details on the wines either I won't know or I'll have to supply later on. Wine 5, moving on to the reds. Something that I think you as buyers and me as a wine writer, if that's how I describe myself, look for all the time is good value Pinot Noir. People love the style of wine that the grape provides, that kind of fresh, light-bodied, aromatic style of red. It's so easy to drink. It's so inviting aromatically. And it's so versatile. It goes so well with such a range of foods. But it's hard to make inexpensive Pinot Noir, and it's quite easy to find quite pricey Pinot that's also disappointing. It's a kind of pernickety grape. And I think, you need very careful handling in the vineyard to make a good example. And for that reason, it's quite labour intensive, and that tends to push up the cost. As a result, I normally say to people that are looking for Pinot Noir below £10 that they might be better off looking for, let's say, a different style or a different source of wine, like a Beaujolais made from Gamay, or a lighter style of Grenache or Garnacha, be it from part of Spain like Navarra or the southern Rhone for lovely light peppery Grenache. In other words, if you want a light-bodied but ripe style of red, maybe don't seek out Pinot Noir. But there are a few exceptions. And here, okay, it's not quite below £10, but it's below £15. It's a UK retailer about 11, which is really quite rare for Pinot Noir. I managed to find in this tasting, without knowing it was a Pinot, but guessing it probably was, a lovely example of a wine that had the hallmarks of Pinot Noir, that was ripe, that was fresh, that was pretty, was well made and inexpensive. And I think for that, there are only a few places in the world that you can get it. You won't find that in Burgundy. You do find it in Chile, but not always. Sometimes the sort of cheaper end of Chilean Pinots can be a little bit jammy. Similarly with California, you can find some inexpensive Pinot, but again, it can be a little bit confected. So here we are. We have an example that's none of those things, that's £11. And it's from the Pays d'Oc. One other place you can find sometimes slightly cheaper Pinot, of course, is Marlborough in New Zealand. Sometimes I find them quite green. They have this really strong kind of tomato stalk character. Some people quite like that. I find it a bit, it interferes a little bit to me with the kind of red berry fruit of Pinot Noir that I look for. So this example. Yeah, tasting it again, I'm really pleased with it. As I said, these wines, any of them I'd happily buy. I'm recommending them to you, I'd recommend them to my friends. I put them in my cellar. In fact, I probably wouldn't put them in my cellar, I'd drink them immediately. These aren't wines really to be kept, maybe at the top end they are, but I'd want to drink them immediately. It's got ripe red berry fruits, fresh cherries, a little bit of tomatoes, a touch of dried herb, a little bit of barrel influence as well, which I think Pinot Noir benefits from because it gives a bit of tannin structure to it and a little bit of wood sweetness. It's not a super fine wine, but I think it's a really good example of Pinot and offers one of the best value Pinot Noirs I've certainly ever tried in my almost 20 years of tasting wine. So I'm really pleased with that. I always think it looks very fine. It looks rather smarter than it costs. So Pinot Noir, that's that one dealt with. As I said, these are just examples that I find. You know, go to the Languedoc-Roussillon, look up producers of Pinot Noir, and if you're really focused on finding inexpensive Pinot Noir, this is a place to go and do some homework. Malbec. I was pleased again. I found a wine that I thought was juicy, that was peppery, that was spicy, that had a lot of interest and character. I didn't know what it was, and it turned out it was Malbec, and I thought, great, I'd really like to show you a Malbec because here's another great variety that's right on trend. And then I looked up who had made it, and it was under the Fortin de France brand, which again I was delighted to see. I really didn't choose it for this reason. It is a coincidence because, of course, as I said earlier, the Pays d'Oc classification kicked off with this particular brand, with Robert Scarley using it to promote the Pays d'Oc and varietally labelled wines from France. Bit of fun to have a Malbec too as well. Okay, so Malbec's native home is the southwest of France, so not far from this part of the country, but still it's not a grape that's particularly closely associated with the Pays d'Oc. And here it is, a really good example, I thought. Try it. It's got a lot of depth, but it's not too sweet, alcoholic or heavy. It's got personality. Yeah, no, I'm really happy with that wine. It's got a lot of red berry fruit. It's a little bit peppery. I think having it blind, it actually reminds me quite closely of Syrah. It's got some olive and pepper and black currant to it, so sort of spiciness that you do find in Malbec commonly, but it maybe has a little bit more coolness than you might find in some of the Malbecs from Mendoza, depending of course on whether they're grown high up in the Uco Valley or when the grapes are harvested. But it's certainly not jammy. It does have quite a strong oak influence, definitely some chocolate and vanilla in there, and it kind of lingers, a bit of toast on the finish, but I like that, and I think people buy Malbec for the juicy red and dark fruit and some of that kind of chocolatey oak influence. It's kind of what they expect. If people are choosing Malbec, it's because they want something quite full and chocolatey and ripe when they're choosing red, and of course it's so closely associated with steak. So I'm glad it's that it offers that style of wine. But it does have a nice balance. It does have quite a firm structure. Of course, Malbec also very well known for its strong evidence of slightly grainy mouth-coating tannins, which is why it's good with marbled red meat. So for me, that really delivers. I think the other thing, looking at these wines, just laying them out an hour ago for this tasting, is I think this has got a really fabulous bottle. It looks great. It's fun, it's distinctive, it's striking, and people are quite rude often about the heavy bottles of South America, the kind of big, weighty Argentine Malbecs. Well, it's made them very successful. It gives them a premium feel. Okay, it's not great for the environment, but this comes in quite a heavy bottle and it gives it quite a premium feel. It's not an expensive wine, it's around a tenner, and again, it looks a lot more expensive than that. It feels more expensive and it tastes more expensive. So I think it delivers a lot of bang for the buck, and I was very pleased to have found that as an alternative to the usual go-to source of Mendoza and Argentina for Malbec. Wine 7, so we've penultimate wine, we're almost there. I need to check the time. I didn't want to keep you for much more than an hour, so I hope this is working out well in terms of timing. This is really interesting, this wine. It's not actually varietally labelled. I didn't know that when I selected it. I didn't know what the grape variety was, but when I saw that it was one of my highest scoring reds and that it was made predominantly with Merlot, it could be varietally labelled because it's 90% Merlot. I thought, brilliant, I'm really pleased because Merlot is the most planted grape in the area and the most produced wine from the Pays d'Oc. And Merlot, despite the fact that people are sneering about it as a grape, perhaps amongst professionals or in the trade, is in fact the most widely planted, one of the most widely planted grapes in the world, along with Cabernet Sauvignon, one of the best-selling red grapes in the UK and the US. And of course, Merlot, the famous basis of Petrus, the most iconic and collected wine label in the world. So let's not knock it. Unfortunately, there is a lot of bad Merlot around. At commercial levels, what does it tend to be? Sometimes it can be a bit sweet and jammy and dull. Other times I find inexpensive Merlot can be a bit overtly herbaceous, a bit leafy, a bit green. This is neither. This is, I think, a really nice example. I think if people are a bit sort of had been turned off Merlot by either of those two extremes, then hopefully this wine would turn them back onto it. It's not expensive, it's not bargain basement, but I think it delivers a lot for around £12. In fact, I was really excited. I'm going to be buying some of this wine. It used to be carried by Berry Brothers and Rudd, and I think they know what they're doing with their buying team. But it's no longer listed that I could see, so I need to look up a source for it. But that's not the point. The point is to find something, in fact, that's hopefully new to the trade. And I think this is a really good example. I'm going to taste it now quickly, so I'm just going to go quiet for a minute. I like it. I like the fact it's quite classic. It's certainly not jammy. It's got lots of sort of nice red berry fruit, a little bit of kind of dark cherry, black cherry too, a touch of sweetness to the fruit. By sweetness I mean ripeness. It's not jammy. It's got quite firm tannins. It's got maybe a hint of dried herbs, not really leafy, but there's an edge to it that gives it a brightness. And then it's got this lovely kind of cedary character. It's not sweet oak. It's more like the impression you get when you just open a box containing cigars, sort of some tobacco leaf, a bit of cedar wood. I think it's complex. I think it's bright. I think it's potentially quite age-worthy. I think it's well made. And I think it's a very interesting wine for £12. It's at the fine wine end of the scale. But I think that's important because it shows you that Pays d'Oc does do some finer, slightly pricier styles of wine. It's not just the bargain basement reds and whites of France. And in fact, for that, you'd probably be looking at Vin de France in any case. But yeah, I was really excited to find this. When I looked up a little bit about Domaine Montlube and this particular wine called La Chapelle, it was interesting to see that it's a domain that's really specialised in Merlot, so that's good. It's made this grape at specialism. And the winemaker called Damien Michel has made Merlot and Bordeaux grapes as specialists to the extent that he's trained at Chateau Mouton Rothschild. So again, I didn't know any of this. It was just a blind tasting, but it's exciting to find a wine of this quality made with this grape from a domain with a pedigree of working with it. Finally, wine 8. This is a Syrah. Now, we haven't looked at a pure Grenache, but I think along with Grenache, Syrah is the red grape that performs notably well in this part of France. And I found a lot of very good wines within the Pays d'Oc classification in that blind tasting that were either Syrah or Syrah Grenache blends or Syrah blends with other grapes, but often a dominance of Syrah in them. Now for this tasting, I really wanted to lead with varietally labelled wines, and by that I mean wines that carried the signature of one grape. But it so happened that actually this pure Syrah from Gabriel Meffre called Loris was one of my highest scoring wines of the day. And in fact, I remember doing that massive tasting. I did it over the course of several days. There's no way I could do 3 wines in that level of detail over the course of anything less really than a week, which is what it took me. But at the end, I got some of these richer reds, and I remember taking half a bottle of this back home with me on my bicycle and consuming it over dinner and thinking, that's really absolutely what I like in Syrah. And what do I like in Syrah? I like some juiciness, some richness, some ripeness, some firm tannins, but also a kind of a pepperiness, sometimes a touch of olive, maybe like tapenade, and then a kind of white pepper element to it. And then oak influence, Syrah of that style really complements a little bit of vanilla and chocolate from barriques. Now, all of that together, that brightness, that juiciness, that pepperiness, and then that kind of sweetness from the oak is something that you do see in fine Syrahs, particularly of the northern Rhone. Let's say an appellation like Saint-Joseph. And it's not hard to find. But, I looked up earlier today, Guigal Saint-Joseph in Majestic at the moment, it's selling for £26 a bottle. Well, this to me has the hallmarks of Syrah, certainly of that quality, and it sells below £15 in the UK. Again, you don't have to agree with me, but that's my feeling. I'm just going to taste it again. Yeah, I still love it. It's very cold in here where I'm tasting because of all the COVID measures that we've taken, because I'm looking at you on a screen, but I'm also being filmed. We've had to open all the windows. It does make the wines taste a little bit raw and a little bit firm, but still, I think this wine has a lot of juicy appeal, and I like the fact that it's got quite a lot of tannin, quite a lot of structure, quite a lot of brightness, almost a kind of, Morello cherry element to it, along with that pepper. I think it would age quite well. I'd be very happy to cellar that wine. It may even benefit from a few years resting in underground in a cool cellar to develop greater complexity. But now I think it's a delicious wine. I think it's great value. Gabriel Meffre, big producers, I think now owned by Boisset, but they do a lot of brands from this part of France, things like Fat Bastard, if you've heard of them, big seller for Chardonnay under Vin de France in the US market. But very good producers of commercially relevant wines at all scales. And Loris is the name of their top tier of reds, named after the oak barrels used in their élevage. So that is a selection of 8 wines. As I said, it's a tiny snapshot, bearing in mind there are 1,000 producers in the Languedoc or within the Pays d'Oc. And it's a tiny snapshot of just the sheer number of samples that I was sent for this tasting. But I hope that gives you a taste of what you get with the Pays d'Oc when it comes to varietally labelled wines using what are the most commercially relevant grapes today for the UK consumer. I'm just going to have a look now. I'm just trying to see if there are any further questions on my screen here. I don't see any that are particularly general. A few specifics about various wines I think are probably best answered after this session over email. You can contact me directly on patrick@thedrinksbusiness.com. But just really to sum up, I think it's important to say that the Pays d'Oc offers something really very special for winemakers in this amazing viticultural haven in the south of France, and that is the freedom. They can be creative. They can do what they like. They've got 58 different grape varieties to play with. They can blend them. They can do dual varietals, or they can do varietal wines like these. It could be an Albarino, it could be a Malbec, it could be a Merlot, or it could be something more historic to the region, such as a Carignan, a Grenache, or a Syrah, like the one we've seen just now. So it doesn't always have to be terribly unusual, but it's a place where people can be innovative. And I think what's important to say is that that doesn't run counter to the great AOPs of the Languedoc-Roussillon, be it Minevois or Corbière, or even their cru like Corbière-Boutinac or Minevois La Livinière. There's some great wines from this part of France. But what you get with the AOP is you get the strictures, you get the controls, you get more of a terroir-driven wine. And I think that's really important to bear in mind, the fact that there are 2 different types of wine that come from this one vast viticultural region of France, and that they're complementary. When it comes to the Pays d'Oc, however, to conclude, from my perspective, and I hope you're seeing this today from these wines and from this brief presentation, what you've got is something really special, because you have a region that's diverse, a region with a long history, and really importantly, a region that offers wines that are great value for money and consumer oriented. And from my perspective, I really can't think of a part of the world that does all of those things quite as well as the Pays d'Oc. So with that said, thank you very much indeed for listening. I hope you enjoyed the masterclass. I hope the wine showed very well. And of course, now you have the benefit of having them in your homes. You can finish them off over dinner and see how they fare over the course of an evening. Thank you very much indeed for listening.